So hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar with Arthur and myself, and we're looking at the new era of PMO maturity. So we've spent many years progressing to this point, and it hasn't been continuous. It's actually sort of started around 2017, so it's very nice to sort of come to this point to actually present the model and actually what we're doing. And Arthur has been working with us. I've known Arthur now for probably 2 years. We actually met at NEOM. We actually met on the aeroplane, just talking, and sort of drove across the desert of NEOM to NEOM across the Red Desert. And then we sort of built a friendship up, and Arthur will explain his background. And so we've been working ever since. So what we're going to cover off today is looking at, besides the introduction and welcomes, the basics around benchmarking, and then going beyond that. And then we're looking then at our benchmark model. We're going to talk about maturity and impact. And in fact, we have been testing a lot of this during the courses. So all the courses we actually run, the difference between what we do, for example, and PMI or P3O, for example, is that we have these case studies that we solve real problems and not just a sort of cookie cutter thing. And within that, we've actually designed it as such as the first part of that actually looks at the current state assessment, which is actually the basis of what we use for the maturity model. So we've developed this about 3 years ago. We've been evolving it and improving it. And that's why actually when people take the exam, and you'll hear about this actually when we give the awards in 2 weeks' time for the top marks of the foundation practitioner and expert, that there's actually a case study part as well. So you actually see that case study piece. They don't actually look at, actually, no, they do look at the maturity assessment, not using this model, but a simple version of it or a simplistic model. So they get the idea of benchmarking of the concepts. So this is actually where we're based in Switzerland. In the background, in fact, I'm just calling, I'm actually in the office now, I'm at home. And actually this is the same sort of village, or the same village as Roger Federer and Martina Hingis, she lives here. It's a sort of nice place to live on the Lake of Zurich. So background, most of you probably know me. I actually founded AI PMO back in 2015. I'm an assistant professor. I was a professor at Swiss Business School for a number of years. Now I've moved across to Alma Mater, which is a university. So I have to sort of get my professorship back now, or earn the professorship. I've been working in projects and programs, as probably most of you have, for many years. In fact, probably it's more than 35. It's probably more like 45. And I really enjoy going across different industries. So I've worked in consulting and manufacturing. I also never worked in construction before. So this is when actually, when we bid on the NEOM ePMO, and we actually won the project based on actually this book here. So if you haven't got this, this is the PMO Service and Capabilities book. It took us 3 years to write it. It's about 700 pages. It's a book that we actually used to win the project, and then we built the ePMO based on that. In fact, we have 2 other books, and you'll see a bit later, and we've actually tested everything in the books. We built the methodologies. In fact, they've been used on different projects. Besides these 3 books, there's book chapters and research papers, and we actually have 7 research students looking at different things that we want to actually understand more. For example, PMO is proactive and reactive. I remember back actually when Chris was on the first course in Switzerland in the mountains, we talked about reactive PMOs, and is there a ratio between proactive, reactive, depending on the different type of PMOs that you could use as a sort of a benchmark, whether it's healthy or not? We don't know, and one of the students is actually looking at that. Amir, who's present now, he's actually looking at topics, and I think Wesley's probably here as well, and Thomas. So these are the 3 doctorate students that are looking at set topics in the PMO project management domain. And the nice thing is that we encourage more of you to go and do it because we want to understand more. So it's not just my opinion or the opinion of Arthur, whether it's actually developing a certification or maturity model, for example. So this is in the quest of understanding. I've actually worked for the British government, so I was involved with the predecessor of Prince 2. It's actually called CCTA in Millbank back in the 80s. And then I've volunteered for PMI and the core committee on the portfolio standard, my PhDs and methodologies, and also built the frameworks for AI PMO. And then I've been architecting with one of my students, the actual maturity model. And Arthur's been working for the last number of months, also operationalizing it into an operational model. So that's my background. If I can hand over to Arthur.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Yes, my name is Arthur Gertsch, as Robert mentioned. I've known Robert now for just over a year and a half, nearly 2 years. And well, no, it's actually just over 2 years now. Just over 2 years. November it was 2 years. And as he said, we met in Saudi Arabia when we were going to NEOM, started working together. A bit about my background. I started my career many years ago in the defense industry. Went into management consulting, started working at clients where I got dropped in, and managing projects, and I got dropped into starting and setting up PMOs. So I stumbled into this area by accident, but ever since about 1999, I've been doing quite a lot in it, and that's how Robert and I also started speaking. Ended up working with Robert on a couple of other things with the AI PMO, and he started telling me about the maturity model, and that was very interesting. So I started working with him on developing the maturity model to do the maturity model assessments. Worked across a couple of industries, worked in defense, as I mentioned, aviation, financial services, oil and gas, also a little bit in mining and fast-moving consumer goods, and now spending quite a lot of time with Robert on maturity assessments and doing maturity model.
Great. So very important that we're actually a Swiss organization. We try to work to the Swiss standards. Switzerland, if you don't know, has got the highest number of PhDs people per capita, the highest number of patents per capita, and it's successful because of its, I think, the sort of the work ethos, and also, as you see from the picture, I'm actually just talking where this red dot is. It's a very inspiring place to be. So I'm very lucky to sort of be here, and also found AI PMO in Switzerland. Just quickly, I don't really want to talk a lot about AI PMO, but just so you know, we do certifications, the actual courses. We cover both the theoretical side, or the knowledge, and we do the practice. And so therefore, anybody that wants to come on and view the results of a course can, because every course, whether it's the foundation practitioner and the expert, these ones particularly, they actually create case studies and they present them, and the people sitting in the group, and it could be their bosses, it could be anybody else. There's a whole marking system, so we actually mark it objectively. Just like Aviva, when you do your PhD, you actually anybody can sit in there and listen to the presentation. It's the same as well. So moving on. Certified members, we have around about 2,000, slightly over, and then the different countries in the world. We don't do pre-recorded, or ours are all live courses. We do virtual and we do face-to-face as well. In fact, we combine the two together. And we've now learned over years since COVID how actually to go and do both. So that's us. So that's a bit of the background of AI PMO. Then let's have a look at the essentials of benchmarking. And this is where I'd like to hand over to Arthur to take over.
Thank you, Robert. So one of the main purpose of having a maturity model is so that you can understand where you are, and also how you compare to other organizations in similar industries and even across different industries. So when we look at comparing you to another organization, you need to have a benchmark. And there's some definitions that we're just quickly going to run through. So the benchmarking is to set yourself and compare yourself against somebody else, another organization in the same industry, even against an organization in a different industry. Then we'll have the maturity model, which is the tool that we use to assess our organization, in this case, our PMO. And then we'll also understand what the state is that we are in. It's a factual period that's of being mature in a scale. So how mature you are against something that you set out initially. There are different types of maturity models. There are quite a lot of them out there in different industries around project management. I think most people know that. Process management, software development and architecture. There's also in continuous improvement and delivery, energy infrastructure. There's a whole list there, but maturity models is not a new thing that is being introduced now. It's an existing concept, and we're just taking it very specifically into PMO. And that's something that is unique to us, and Robert will speak a bit more about that later. So there's a need. Why is there a need for benchmarking? Why do you want to do that? Why do you want to compare yourself? Well, it's first of all to understand your performance and improving that, to manage risk. As we see there, fostering a culture of excellence, which again comes to improving your performance and how you are doing what you are doing best. Driving innovation, finding new ways of doing things and improving it. Improving the quality of what you're doing as well, so that your customers, your stakeholders are satisfied with what you're giving them. It's also understanding the competition, and that can be internal and external, and we'll speak about that a little bit later. But it's who is competing with the same resources, to understand how you're doing against them. Then it's adopting of good or leading practice so that you're continuously improving, which we also saw earlier, and that fostering a culture of excellence. So doing something better, doing something in a different way, so that you getting the best value and the best benefit. And then also for strategic decision making, if you know where you are and what your condition is, and how you measure against others, you know if there's room for improvement, if you're at the top of your game, if you need to continuously improve and drive new innovation to stay ahead, or if you've got some catching up to do. But it gives you a understanding of where you are compared to where the others are and where you want to be. So as I said, you've got internal and external benchmarking. Internal will be within the organization. It can be against a different PMO in the organization. It can be against a different business unit or department. It can be against a similar business, but in a different region of the same international organization. And then there's also external benchmarking, where you're looking at other organizations, typically in the same industry, but something that's unique on our maturity model is it's ambivalent of the type of industry. We can measure any type of industry. It's not for a specific type. And therefore, you can also find yourself comparing your PMO to a PMO in a different industry. Excuse me. Then there's also strategic benchmarking, to understand and examine how you achieve your performance and how you can improve that, and derive new strategies to improve and get better at what you're doing. There's performance benchmarking, to comparing the metrics and the KPIs that you set yourself for the PMO and the organization against those of other leading organizations, and understanding where you're going, where you need to improve, so that, again, that you know you're at the top of your game. There's looking at processes, internal processes in the organization or in the PMO or in the department, of how you improve specific ways of operating and how you do things, the steps that you go through, if it's efficient, if it is wasteful, or if it's at comparing against leading practice. And then lastly, the products, the outcomes that you are producing, and comparing that product with a different one. So we'll give you a view of that based on the outcome. Then there are a couple of prerequisites for doing benchmarking. The first one is you need to have clear objectives. Why are you doing your benchmarking? What is it that you want to achieve? You need to have management support. So from a high level, you need buy-in. If you're going to try and benchmark without the support and the top cover from higher up in the organization, people won't take it seriously. You won't get the information you need, and it will be a wasted exercise. And there's research and selection of benchmarking partners. You can partner with organizations, competitors even, because you can learn from each other, even though you're not giving away trade secrets, and that can make both organizations perform better. You need to establish your metrics and the data collection method. So what is it that you want to measure? How are you going to measure it? How are you going to know if you're doing well or not? And how are you going to get that data? Is it interviews? Is it data from your systems, internal or external? Is it generally available data? Is it proprietary data? And then you need to obviously crunch that numbers to understand what the output is and to be able to interpret it. Then understanding the current state is knowing about where you are now, because you need to understand what it is that you're doing now, so that you can evolve into a higher level of operation. Cross-functional benchmarking teams, so that is not just the internal focus of people in your own team, but if you're working with other different teams, different departments, etc., you can learn from one another, have cross ideas, crossing over of ideas, and providing different ways of working, learning from one another. You need to have an effective communication plan. So you need to understand and let the organization know why you're doing this, why you're going on this journey, what the benefits are going to be, what you expect of them, so that everybody gets on board and takes part in this. Otherwise, you're going to waste time, resources, and not get the ultimate benefit that you could potentially get of going on this journey. Then you've got need to have commitment to change and improvement. So once you understand where you are, you still need to know what you're going to do with this, and you need the buy-in and the commitment of different departments, the management team, the executive team, that they're going to spend time, effort, money, resources to do that improvement, because that is the whole purpose of benchmarking yourself, so that you can up your game and become better at what you're doing. And then there's obviously confidentiality and ethical considerations, depending on what type of work you do, where you are, what the information is that you gathered. When you look at your data collection methods and the metrics and the data that you're going to be going, you might have personal data of people, what their training status is and qualifications, etc. That's not something people want to have known all over the world if they don't just want that disclosed. So you need to know that you need to be confidential with other people's information, for example, or if you're sharing information with another company and they're sharing with you, that you keep that confidential. And lastly, you need to have a continuous improvement mindset, so that you learn from this to be able to do something better. And then you have that learning organization where you correct any activities after you've measured them to become better at what you're doing. And then
so the only other one is actually you should really, it takes about 12 to 18 months to actually go through a maturity level. So it's not a one-time event. So you once you do the first assessment, you have your improvement plan, part of your MBOs, managing by objectives, and then when you're ready then to do the next assessment to see whether you moved up, irrespective of whether it's an internal or external assessment that you're doing. So any other points you wanted to say, Arthur, or are you okay on that? Okay.
Yeah, I think I've covered everything. I think the only thing that I think we must mention as well is that when you're doing a maturity assessment, one of the ways that we also designed this PMO, and I think you'll talk a bit more about it later, is that the PMO evolves. So because you're going to a different state every time, the organization adapts, the organization changes, and the way you measure the maturity of that PMO needs to adjust and adapt, or be able to measure an adjusted and adapted organization, so that you can grow with the organization and be able to continuously measure what those changes that have happened since the last assessment.
Mm-hmm. Actually, it was interesting. There was a research paper that Monique Aubrey produced back in 2010, and she talked about organizations changing every 2 years. And of course, the PMO is part of an organization. It has what we call embeddedness, and it changed. And then the Gardner Group read it and thought they actually said that 50% of PMOs actually fail. Well, actually, then he looked at 18 PMOs in 15 companies across Sweden and I think it was Canada. So you can't generalize that. But the Gardner Group said that 50% of them fail. And in fact, then PMI picked up on it and sort of said the same. 50% of PMOs fell within 2 years. And then everybody thinks that, in fact, there's still, I guess, people like Ralph Fitchett, I think his name is. He keeps sending me things of conferences he goes to, says 50% of PMOs fell within 2 years. In fact, I almost fell into the trap when I was presenting a conference at the PMO House of PMO in England in 2017. And I actually spoke to Monique and said, look, I always check if I'm doing something, I always check the sources, and I couldn't find anything about it failing. And she said, no, they misunderstood totally. Then she wrote another paper 2 years later saying about a false paradigm. And in fact, at that conference, I gave a 50-minute talk about, is it fake or is it fact? Fake news, fake information. You've got to be so careful of which organizations you actually take information from. And is it actually proven, or is it just somebody's viewpoint they're trying to sell something? So in that case, it was some big organizations, but they're just totally misunderstood. And of course, they have a PMI or the Gardner Group have got a massive influence on the population as a whole. Okay, so let's move on beyond the traditional benchmarking. So PMO benchmarking, the reason we want to go and do it is really similar to the reasons why you do benchmarking as we described before. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing is that you're looking at leading practice, not something that's lagging in the sense of historical. You take all of these points, looking at knowledge, strategic alignment, improvement, etc. So at the end, you want to increase stakeholder value. That's the key point, that you stay relevant. That when you talk to your customers, they say you're doing a great job versus, well, I don't know what they do, and well, they're bureaucrats or policemen. So this is really the idea, and you've got something that you can say on the paper, look, this has been benchmarked, this is how well we're doing compared with the previous year, and also it's actually something that's very useful if you want to be put into awards. So when you look at the global awards of PMOs, it's not just you saying you're doing it and somebody believing what you're saying, you actually have empirical evidence based on a benchmark that's actually trusted. So really, these are the sort of things that should create awards versus what just people say, because there's inherent bias in what people say. The problem with the benchmarks or the tools or models that are used, for example, OPM3 from PMI, which I think is taken off the market, is it's very much process procedural driven. So the aim is you sort of go up to level 1 to sort of level 5 up here, and then you're looking at, have you implemented this process or this particular procedure? So the idea is that the more you automate things, the more efficient you are. The problem is that organizations change. So as they're changing and everything is in computer systems, if that doesn't change, in fact, it has a negative effect. Efficiency drops out. You get into some sort of procedural straitjacket. And with organizations that are actually growing very rapidly, is that you want to be careful of how much you actually sort of stick into process of procedure and documentation. And this is probably why Agile actually came along as well, is that there's a balance there. In fact, I don't show it in this model, in this presentation here, but when we were looking, it was Dr. Peter Cowell, who was my student, my doctorate student. We actually said, well, really what you want to do is you want to walk before you run. So you walk up here, and then you go through this, we call it a flex point. And then you actually then transition into, you learn to master the rules, so you follow procedure, and then you can break it. And this is the same thing that Dreyfus competency model talks about, is that if you know nothing, you follow the procedures, but when you become competent, then you can transcend upon those. And in fact, that's the reason why Agile came about, is because the old guys that actually were trying to change the 2 digits to 4 digits in the year 2000 said, look, we're experts, we're 65 years old or older, we know all this stuff, just let us go and do it because the deadline is fixed. And we actually see the same thing as well with these models, is that they need to transition from being process to principle-based. So that term we used, inflection point, we actually saw in 1 or 2 papers back in 2005, they talked about inflection, but they didn't actually describe the model. So we knew onto the right thing, and this was about 3 years ago. So some of the shortcomings of using these maturity models for PMOs. First of all, they're not designed for PMOs. Just like if you use diesel in a benzene car or a gas car, it just doesn't work. And so the maturity models that are typically used are ones that are procedural based. Projects are about repeatability. PMOs are about adaptability. And that's the thing, is that PMOs adapt. And the problem with the researchers is they looked, and I'm critical because when I look back, is they actually sort of looked and took snapshots of a PMO and said, oh, this PMO is this type of PMO, it does this. The thing is, in 6 months' time, it does something completely different. It evolves. In fact, Monica Albury talked about PMOs don't mature, they evolve and they adapt. And that has been in the papers and other research papers as well. So there's no real context differences here with the existing models. It's about repeatability in the PPM models. It doesn't take into account direct and indirect influences. So PMOs actually may be involved in project delivery, and they may not be involved in project delivery. So there may, if it's project delivery, it could be direct involvement, but also it does indirect, and you need to account for that. And we've actually worked out a way that you can look at not just the maturity, so the processes and services you've got in place, but the impact you actually make. And that's why we actually talk about a maturity and impact model. There's 2 separate scales. So process procedures process procedure driven. These models don't actually have principles. They're just purely a process model. The new ones, I've seen some of the new maturity models for Agile coming out and they're playing around with it, but it really takes quite a lot of skill to produce one that works. It only covers explicit knowledge rather than near tacit knowledge. So explicit is what's written down, tacit is what's in your head. So when you sit at a board meeting or a decision, at a meeting, do you look at bits of paper or do you sort of remember things? And, you might reference to some reports or dashboards. So they talk about near tacit knowledge, and we actually cover that as well. Also, these things are not service-based. There's some other things as well, the shortcomings of the model. So if I just take, for example, the Axelis P3M3, OPM3, the Carnegie Mellon maturity model, but also this thing called PMO Cube. This was actually done by Global Alliance. America did this back in 2017 or 2018, something like this. So the 31 characteristics actually come from research from Peter Cole. So he published about 6 conference papers. You see the PMO characteristics, the best one is actually from Axelis here. The worst one is actually the maturity cube. So in fact, what Americo did is he took the 27 functions from Monique from a paper in 2012. He built this thing in a 3-dimension, and he called it a maturity cube, but he never developed it further. And in fact, that's what the value ring is based on, this thing that was back in 2012. In fact, what we have in the book I just showed you is 227 services. His is equivalent to a service, it's got 27. So really, it's not necessarily a numbers game, but you do want granularity. So, but this thing that he actually did was never designed. And Monique said, I never designed this to do a maturity cube, but that's what he developed it. So we actually have ours. I didn't put it here, but of course ours is empirically designed. So it covers all 31 of the characteristics, and it actually covers more as well. So that's just a little bit of a background. So looking at the attributes of this new model, it's principle-based, that's what you'd expect. It's service-focused, it's adaptable, it's benefit-driven. We deal with explicit and near tacit. And we also cover all the behavioral side, decision-making, leadership aspects of it. We cover both maturity, so it's not just what you know, it's the impact you make, the same with the PMO. In fact, we saw this with one of the clients that came from the top consulting companies. They actually described in the case study, and I said, I could actually predict what was happening, like they're going to get audited, and they were. In fact, they had really top people, but they failed miserably. So there's a difference between them having all the process and actually can they apply it. PMO independent, so this is what Arthur said as well, industry independent. It doesn't really matter what type of PMO. In fact, there's lots of these silly discussions about what is a PMO, is an SMO, or a transition management officer, a type of PMO. In fact, we cover that in the new standard to clarify that. And ours is the only model in the world that's empirical tested. So it's taken us a long period of time to get to. In fact, when we say long, this is actually when we started in 2017, and we're now in 2024. It's taken that amount of time, and these are all the conference papers we produced. And this is like the picture of the maturity model. We haven't worked on it all the time because we did other things, but it's been in every course that we give, and we actually sort of discussing it as part of the success and maturity module. There's people that look in and give us feedback on that. So it's taken a long time in coming. In fact, the model is based on the 227 services in here. We actually use that as part of the case of the courses. Before we had this book, people couldn't describe really what they did. Since we had this book, it's like night and day in actually how much they progress and what they achieve. We use the principles in here. We use the methodologies, for example, and we use content on this. It's not published yet, but it's actually first reviews with the PhD students or the DBA students. So people like Amir and Thomas, for example, and Wesley have actually seen the first or parts of it. We just need to get it finished off and published. So we actually use parts of the knowledge and the research is actually in these books here. So this is actually a set of integrated frameworks. I remember actually Thomas says to me, he's one of the students, he's actually ex-president of Germany. He says to me, I'm very fond of frameworks. And I think actually it was a McKinsey quote, actually says, if you haven't got structure, your ideas won't stand up. And that's absolutely true, is that if you can master frameworks, and then you need to make sure they're messy, and we use that term in consulting, management consulting, it means there's no gaps and overlaps between all these boxes. So it's mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. That sounds easy to do, but believe me, it's not. And so the framework that Chris saw, it actually was a part of this. In fact, this was not MISI at the bottom. It is now. I actually worked with another guy in the US, and he had this thing that looked very nice, but it caused all sorts of problems. Now, this has actually evolved here. And then we now have this integrated into the service lifecycle. In fact, some of the things in the standard, you see monitoring controlling, you don't actually need this thing here because it actually is covered by this one. Or somebody made a comment, do you have to have it down here? We've got it up here. So we try to make sure that all our frameworks are efficient. That's what agile means, is efficiency. And so this actually is a bit of an older picture here. We're actually going to take this thing out and this one down here. So these are two frameworks. They all integrate to each other. This PMO topology, service topology. So this is something that's used in all the courses. It basically means where the PMOs are located in the organization. So like a network structure, a service topology is a three-level structure between the service domain, service group, the domain, the group, and the actual services, and they vary between each of the PMOs, and you actually connect the two together. So the topology and the service topology connect. This is a brand new thing here, which you cannot look at the maturity of a PMO unless you find this piece of the puzzle. This took us 2 years to work out, and it was a real mind bender. And with 2 PhD students, actually at Swiss Business School. And then we published a paper in Switzerland back in 2022 on this. And I'll talk a little bit about this. And then we have all these measurement points down here. So Arthur will talk, we'll talk a little more about it in a second. So what are these sort of domains of control, influence, and concern? So the domain of control, so this is actually where the PMO has mandated services that must be taken. And the reason why we came up with this concept is that if a PMO is a service-oriented organization, you haven't got a choice with some services because they're actually because of compliance or because they are assurance services. So you actually mandated to go and do that. So we have this definition. So this is what they actually mandated in the contract, for example, they're mandated. The domain of influence, this is really important because it may be that a PMO is only doing a third of what it should be doing. So we actually saw for 4 or 5 years now that we have PMO directors coming or people coming on the course, we do the case studies, and they're only doing about a third of what they should be doing. So they come really confident and they leave thinking, oh my goodness, I've got so much to go and do. So that means that if only a third of the PMOs are achieving their full potential, and I use that quote because that came from PMI, that means 2/3 are not. And I would even challenge that 1/3 is even achieving it. And there's some slides I don't have in this pack that talks about the different parts of what you need to combine to reach your maximum potential, this thing here. So this is the domain of influence. So this is where you can actually put in your services. You can also, you may be a center of excellence, which is a type of PMO, and you can actually put a service in another PMO. So this is where you work with that PMO and that one works with yourself. So there's actually these 3 parts to it. And the domain of concern is anything that could actually risk the domain of influence and the domain of control. So in other words, minimize or improve your maximum potential benefit. That's all about the services you put in. So this is actually what we use, and we've actually tested with, I think Deloitte's were the test client for the PhD student, and then we've now tested it for about a year now. And we've got all these diagrams, and I've given it to Arthur actually, and he also gives the courses as well to actually put it together. So that's an absolutely key part. Without that, you cannot compare one PMO against another. And the secret actually is that you don't make an absolute, you make it relative to itself. And this is how we actually go and do it. That if you make it relevant to itself, you say, well, this is what you can do, and this is only what you're achieving. The difference is actually the maturity. There's a bit more than that, but that's how we work it out. So maturity assessment process, you look at the problem motivation, you define the objectives, you go to the baseline. We talked about the steps before, then the current state assessment. So this is absolutely key. So in the course and on the projects, if it's just for one PMO, the current state assessment would take a week, for example, or could take longer if it's a big PMO, talking to not only just the people that are delivering the services, but also we look at a data triangulation on where we actually look at what people perceive versus the reality. We look at the difference between the two. So we've got delivery PMOs and non-delivery PMOs. So for example, a COE may be delivering a service, but not delivering directly into a project. And then we look at maturity and impact. So how well they're set up. So this is equivalent to project management success. Like the Sydney Opera House, for example, was a project management failure, but it was a project success because the Sydney Opera House exists. So this thing here, the impact is, was it a positive outcome? Did the project actually achieve it all? So we actually measure this from either the service targets, if it's indirect, or we measure it directly from the goals of the project itself. So this is how we actually do it. So we look at the maturity and impact model, and this is what Arthur's going to do a demo. We look at the strategic life cycle. There's all these checkpoints we have across 22 service domains. So for example, in England, I think they use 7. We've actually got 24. We actually have 2 more that's actually been stated into the service book. It's all principle based, and we look at explicit and near tacit. And then we do a triangulation, and then we actually looking at the scoring of this, which is very nice because we don't rely on just one source of data. We also get a second source of data and triangulate and put into insights. So this is the current state. And you might say, okay, that's great, but what about the future? Well, this is actually, we don't offer this in the model, but there's, of course, the reports you create, and if you want consultants, like in most organizations, they can then help you then create your target operating model, which sort of consists of the output of this, the organizational design, your topology, service topology, the governance, and reporting, as well as all the capability and capacity. This all then comprises of how you get to your target in the future. So at this point, I am going to hand over to Arthur to give you a peek of our maturity model.
Okay, so thank you. So as Robert mentioned, we used the framework as the basis on which we built this maturity model because we need structure, and there are different elements to it. So the first area that we look at is the strategic purpose and alignment of your PMO to your organization. So we do an assessment to see, is your strategy aligned to the strategy of the organization? Is the vision and mission aligned for the PMO aligned to that of the organization? Because if they're not aligned, you're already starting on a bad foot. You are going to diverge and go off in a different direction, and you're obviously not going to achieve what you set out to achieve. So we have a look at the different elements of it, and then you have specific strategic objectives, and we measure if those strategic objectives are achieved and how well they are achieved. The next area that we look at is the service domains. So we've got, at the moment in Robert's book, there are 22, but I think in the next version there will be 24. So we've already built the maturity assessment to take into account the additional 2 service domains. Now, each of these service domains, and you'll see it a bit later, has got a lot of different services associated with it. I think, Robert, you mentioned 270 or something?
No, it's 230 or something like this. I mean, the important point is that we can never get the full number of services in that book, and it's crazy because it's like 600, 700 pages. We explain in a consistent way how to create it yourself. So if you can't actually create a service after seeing 237, probably shouldn't be in the PMO side. So, and that's why the model allows you to add your own services in there, as well as all the case studies we allow, people put the services in, and then we look at different factors and things like this. But clearly this is far more sophisticated because it's taken us a long time to develop, but the concepts are the same within the case studies for the courses.
Thank you. So a couple of interesting things here is, the first thing we do is we measure how well you are doing what you are currently doing. And that is one of the purposes of looking at the service domains. We'll get to a different perspective of that a bit later, and I'll explain it a bit later. But as you can see, there are some areas here on this diagram that's got a 0 score. And that is not an error or somebody doing something bad and you're being penalized for it, or not necessarily. It could also be that a service is not relevant to your PMO, to the organization that you are in. Because it's not to say that you have to have all 24 of these services. And that is one of the ways that we make our model unique, is that you can identify which services you are providing, and it will only score you on those services that you are providing. You're not being penalized for the ones that you're not providing when we look at how well you're doing what you're doing. So in this service domain assessment, it only takes into account what you are busy doing. And then you've got each of these service domains we have a whole lot of data points that we go and collect data on. In this case, I've got 20 here, but there are some have got a bit fewer, some have got more. And we look at, first of all, does it meet the specifications for each one of those data points? And also, does it meet the stakeholder needs? And then we also develop a score for each one of those data points, and then you get a collective score. So, and then we also look at the quality of that, which is this second graph. We're not going to go into all the details for each one of these 22. I've just got 2 up here, where you can see the different data points that we collect, some scores that were assessed based on some data that we put in to test the model, and these are the outputs. Now, obviously, across the 22, you then get the ultimate score as well. If we move down, then we get to the triangulation that Robert mentioned earlier. So this is where we get a assessor's view of the maturity of the organization, of how well they are doing what they are doing. And then we also get the stakeholder perspectives. And what they perceive to be the value that they're getting. Does the PMO have enough services? Do they give guidance on governance and compliance, and do they help with delivery of the projects? Are they do you realize the benefits of these projects, etc., etc.? And these graphs here give, first of all, the stakeholder perception. So these are the different stakeholders, and we've got a couple of them that I put in here to show, but it's you can change them. So there's certain ones that are fixed. So the PMO manager, the project managers, their names will change so that you know where they are. Then the different stakeholders, there are different stakeholders that so we just call them client 1, 2, 3. Then there are external departments, etc. So we look across the board of all the different stakeholders in the organization. By metric, we also look at strategic alignment, the PMO services catalog, governance and compliance. So it's how well are you doing, and what is the impact that you are delivering? And that's where we're bringing those two together that Robert mentioned earlier. And for each one of these stakeholders, we get their view on each one of these metrics. And then we also compare the internal and external stakeholders, because, and what we mean by that is internal stakeholders will be your project managers, the people that work in the PMO manager, etc. And your external stakeholders will be the clients of the PMO. Sorry, I said that the PMO, the project managers. The project managers will be clients. So it's the people working in the PMO and the people outside of the PMO, the external stakeholders. And we try and triangulate to see what is the difference in perception of what's the internal view compared to the external view. Because if there's a massive discrepancy, that also tells us there's an area to go and investigate and dig a little bit deep in, because there must be a reason why the PMO thinks they're doing a wonderful job, but the people using the PMO services don't think so at all. And if the scoring isn't aligned, then you know there's something wrong.
Yeah, just add to that, if that's okay.
Yep.
So you see here stakeholder perception of maturity and impact. We've actually just put the two into one diagram, but we would actually split it. So so it may be that John Smith, for example, says, okay, no, they're really great guys, but they fail in every project. And that's going to be really interesting when we see the insights, and is there a consistent story? Also, with this maturity model and impact model, when we see that there's problems, for example, if there's a divergence between internal and external stakeholders, or differences between maturity and impact, we're going to get all sorts of insights when we have a methodology, how we actually look at root cause analysis, which is also done on the course. And invariably what happens is that the PMO is suffering what we call from a type 1 or type 2 error. It maybe is a type 1 is when they're doing it but not properly. So maybe it's a service they're actually doing that's not properly implemented, not meeting the service targets, or a type 2 is they're actually offering things that are not required at all. And so therefore they're wasting time and resources. So we actually look into the root causes, and we can actually go back to this, and invariably we actually pinpoint where the problem is, because we've done that assessment of root cause analysis of the problems in the organization. So this is the next step after, when we are looking at current state, see where the root causes are. We then actually determine that, and then if they want, we can continue further forward and actually build up a target operating model.
I just want to check before I continue. You're still seeing my screen because it hasn't got a red box around it like on
No,
Teams,
there's no red box around it, so it's okay.
but it's working. Okay. All right, then the next one, as we mentioned earlier, is this is a principle-based maturity model. So we also look at the principles of the organization, the PMO, and if relevant, the projects as well. The reason for that is because it's not a tick box exercise. We want to see if there are principles that the PMO adheres to or works around and according to, rather than a set of rules, because there's always an exception to a rule. There'll always be some project or some situation that will make it different. And that's why we use principles based. And that is, I think, one of the other unique things here is because that makes it more robust to take different scenarios and different situations into account and to be able to manage those as well. As I mentioned earlier, initially when we look at the service and the service domains, we looked at how well you are doing what you are doing. But what happens if there are things that you should be doing that your PMO is not doing? That's a service that they should be providing that it's not providing. So in our model, we go through those 24 service domains, and we look at each of the subcategories as well. And there we determine how well you are, if you're doing it, or if you're not doing it, if you should be doing it. So if you are doing it and you should be doing it, you get marks for that. If you're not doing it, but you should be doing it, you get negative marks for it. And there's a whole lot of different elements below, and you can add your own things as well if you need to. And that's why there's a positive and a negative score. And it might sound counterintuitive, but it means that you've got, there are some things that you should be doing and you are doing. And then there are things that you should be doing that you're not doing under this heading of customer integration, for example. And that's why you can have a positive and a negative score, and then you have a net score. That's the gray bit here. And what we're doing is we're looking at in the services that you should be providing, are you providing it, and where are their shortcomings? And for example, you can see there's a whole lot of blank areas here. That is where we identified, in this case, you do not have to do these services and you're not providing it. Because if you don't have to provide a service, but you are providing it, you're basically wasting resources. You're allocating a scarce resource to do a job that's not necessary to do. And we pick that up as well. And that's something that's, I think, also unique to this maturity model, because it starts telling you the known unknowns as well as the unknown knowns.
Yeah, known unknowns, the unknown unknowns, yeah.
Then, and apart from in each of these subsections where you can add your own, you can also add your own services, as Robert mentioned, because it's not a finite list. Very specific industries might have very specific service, or some organizations, their uniqueness is having a very specific product or service. And for that, the PMO needs to manage something very specifically, either as a subset of something else, but take it out, or something different that's not necessarily covered. And we provide the opportunity for you to capture those. If you don't capture anything in there, it doesn't penalize you. It doesn't read it as a 0 and you don't get marks for it. It then ignores it, but if it is there, then it takes it into account. The next area is around the near tacit knowledge, and we look at leadership, culture, decision-making, innovation and entrepreneurship. And some of it, you might argue, is probably written down. Portions of it could be leadership. How do you write down leadership? But you can assess leadership. Is leadership being provided? Is the PMO providing leadership to the different projects and clients that they have? Is there a culture of, and what is that culture? Is that culture positive and strong? And that's where we, again, measure all of these elements and then have a look. And we've got a lot of data points that we look at, and then bring them together into a set of scores. And then lastly, if I can go down, we also, as Robert mentioned, we look at the impact. So what is the impact that the PMO contributes? What is the impact of each of the projects? How well are they doing? And then you can go and compare the impact of a project. Is it being delivered on time, or is it delivering the outcomes that it was supposed to, the product or the service or the whatever it is that this project needs to do, and you can compare this to what is the perception of the clients that use that service. You can compare it to the perception of the project managers, and then also to the PMO, and you can see if there's a difference in opinion, and what is the impact versus what is the maturity, and then you can go and have a look at the specific areas that you potentially need to address in an organization. For example, project 3, 4, and 5 look dire in the example, and something needs to be done. Robert, yeah, I think that sort of shows
That was it, yeah.
where we
It does,
go.
yeah.
So over back to you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Arthur. So there's actually a lot more into the model we don't show. We're just giving you a little sort of snippet for it. In March, when we launch it, we'll actually describe the sort of the levels we're going to have and what's in each one of the levels. And the lowest level will be like a self-service where you can actually sort of use a number of questions, 80, 90 questions, for example, and it will come out with a report. But that won't actually be available in March. It will take us a little time to actually get that operational. What will be operational will be levels 2, 3, and 4 for single PMOs, and I won't go into the details what those levels are. The 5th level is the multi-PMO part, which is really quite complex. That really is an interesting one to look at, but we'll just stick to the single PMO for the moment.
I think there's one here asking, is Peter's research available? I think you mentioned, I think those are the fit. Was that?
Oh, Peter's research, is it available? Oh, yeah, of course it is. Yeah, all his papers are actually, I think you have to look at researchgate.net. So just have a look at that. In fact, when Peter did his characteristics, we actually extended beyond that because when you look at existing PMOs, you sort of see what they're doing, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're all doing the right thing. So what we've done is created this, say, independent model that allows you to look at more aspects than typically was looked at before. But so his is available online, researchgate.net. You can download his papers from that. Will the model be available for general use? Yeah, Eileen, the simple version will be just like in P3O, but then when you start to do the more complex stuff, and this is where we actually look at the different levels of the models, which I've got sketched out in front of me. So the self-assessment, yes. But the self-assessment, the problem with that is it's biased when somebody does it. So we can't really use that for, you need to really have it properly benchmarked like you do for your guys. Sorry.
Can I just add the self-assessment will also be an evaluation of how well are you doing what you're doing. It doesn't go dig into what are you missing and what are the areas that you're not providing that you should be. So it won't measure the potential of the PMO. It will be like a subset of that measurement.
That's right. Yeah. So it gives you a sort of false sense of security, I guess, but at least we ask the questions there. The level 2 then actually looks at an independent person actually doing that. So somebody actually going through, and there'll be more questions. We look at both of the life cycles, the strategic purpose. The level 3 looks at current state. It looks at impact models. It actually has a lot more in it. We look at service gaps, for example. We look at data triangulation. Level 4, this is where we start at the basis of the target operating model. Level 5 is actually multiple PMOs. But we'll go into more detail about the different levels. So it is the first level, Eileen, that would be general use. And then we'll be looking for partners. So if the House of PMO is interested, we have 1 or 2 other partners that are interested as well, doing maturity assessments for us. Any other questions? How about from my students? Wesley or Thomas? Amir? Or am I all everything's clear? So I want to thank everybody if there's no other questions. Wesley, okay. The extent of the service approach to PMOs is quite good. It reminds me of Muller 2016. That's the research side in Wesley. Thank you, Wesley. Yeah, there's actually quite a big difference in the way we designed it. It took a lot of architecting, just like a building. If you're architecting something, and that's why the models. So what the guys in the UK saw when they came over was just a very basic, the first one. And with Eileen and myself and Rolf, we wrote the first book on principles, the PMO principles. And the second version is like, there's no comparison. I didn't realize what I didn't know back in 2017. And like now I know, as all of us know, much more. So that's actually reflected in the second edition. And that's why it's not only just the principles of the PMO, and it took us a long time to synthesize those, but also then we have the whole methodology. That's also within the course, and we've got service principles, we've got service domain principles. So it's really come a long way in thinking. And it's the same thing as well as where this model has been put together. Any other questions?
Now there's another one from.
Oh, yes, yeah. Will companies be granted accreditation to apply for the model for the benefits of the organization? Granted for the accreditation, yeah. So if you do it yourself, you can't really, I mean, you can accredit yourself, I suppose, but the idea is that when it's level 2 and 3 upwards, then it's an independent consultant in doing it, and that you just do more, this is more comprehensive. So it's not meant to be that expensive on level 2, but you need an external approved consultant to go and do that. Level 3 is more impactful. And it goes probably similar sort of pricing, I'm sure, as the P3O assessments, because there's a lot of work in doing the assessments for this. So at level 2 upwards, yes, you get accreditation, not level 1. Any other questions? Okay, so if not, then thank you for your time. I know it's very precious, and there's lots of webinars that are on. I'd say that the next one we're doing is going to be on the 22nd, which is the awards for the top 3 people in the Foundation Practitioner and Expert for the whole of 2023. So there's actually an announcement out on that. And then we also do the case studies. So we'll actually be presenting the case studies. Also, if anybody's interested actually in the future in seeing, so for example, the business partners or future potential clients, we'll invite them onto the end of the course, and they can actually see the case study presentations for the course participants. So we invite L&D people, for example, they come on and see their staff or employees, how well they're actually presenting. So it's a very nice way of doing it. And then after that, the maturity go live, or the launch is actually on the 6th of March. And we haven't announced it formally, but it will be on that date. So at that point, I would like to close up, and I wish everybody a nice evening.
Robert, sorry, there's one more question.
Oh, sorry. Okay, no, okay, Mohammed. If PMOs sit with technology GRC, and we do need to internal maturity, who should perform the assessments? Oh, if you want to do an internal maturity assessment, yeah, governance, risk, and compliance. Well, it really should be your internal audit then, if it's going to be somebody internally, or unless you've got a group. It depends how complex the assessment is and who the customers are, who's best positioned to go and do that. And it's not an easy thing to do, as for people who know that do maturity assessments. It's very easy to be sort of hoodwinked if you're not careful about the questions and what senior guys want you to actually think about. So it's probably going to be internal audit or some sort of compliance or assurance function that would do that. So if that answers your question. Is there another question down here? Oh yeah, is there a conflict if GRC members do it? Well, the thing is, do they know? It all depends the depth they're going to go to. So are they looking at a 40,000-foot view? So they've got no idea really how the PMO works, and I mean, it depends how it's been set up and what it's doing, or whether it's they know they get more involved with it. We need to take this offline probably. I need to understand more about it before I can give an answer to that. But they are your second line of defense, so it should be okay. But I need to understand more. Oh, as they are process owners, I understand. Yeah, yes, please send me email. Yep, no problem at all. We'll send you that. Okay, so thanks everybody. I think I've answered all the questions, if there's no more. So I'll see you in the near future, and feel free to just send questions and we'll respond accordingly. And for the people that are actually part of the AI PMO community, we make announcements at the top level, and we also have the different groups as well. So feel free to ask there. Okay, have a nice evening, everybody. Arthur, thanks very much for presenting, much appreciated.
Thank you for inviting me, Robert.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right. Thanks. Bye-bye.